Okay, so let's begin. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you join us from. I'm Lauren Eckerman with the IIS Secretariat, and you've joined us today for this public background session, which we're holding about 3 weeks after we've begun consultation on an application paper about how to achieve fair treatment for diverse consumers. And this is the IIS's second consultation on the theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion this year. You can find these slides already available on our public webpage at the stakeholder event section of this consultation, and we are now recording this webinar and we will make the recording available on our public website in the coming few days. The purpose of this public background session is firstly to introduce the consultation to you, and there we will briefly cover the context of the IIS's work on the theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll address what is an application paper, so that's the nature of written product that we're consulting on here, and we'll explain what are the ICPs, the insurance core principles, and the process and the timelines for your participation in this consultation. Secondly, the Market Conduct Working Group Chair and Vice Chair will then give an overview of the contents of that draft application paper on how to achieve fair treatment for diverse consumers. And third, the Chair, Vice Chair, the member of the Market Conduct Working Group who is the lead of this project, and myself will be available and happy to answer your questions. And when we come to that Q&A component, what we will do is invite you to raise your virtual hand, and then one by one we will unmute you because on entry to this webinar you are automatically muted. So you would see a red microphone symbol with a line through it. And when we invite you to have the floor and we take you off mute, then that logo, that symbol should go away. Please then ask your question or make your brief comment. So to begin, I'm going to pass you across to Hannah van Voorden, who is the Head of Supervisory Practices and Operations at the IIS Secretariat, to introduce the consultation to you. And she does so in the absence of the IIS's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Champion and Executive Committee member Jerry Cross from the Central Bank of Ireland, who regrets being unable to join us today due to a late and unavoidable conflict. So, Hannah, I pass to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And also, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. I want to thank you all for your interest in the topic. As some of you might be less familiar with the IIS and our work, indeed, I will set the scene with a couple of background slides before we go and dive into the actual paper that is out for public consultation. Let me begin with just a quick recap that the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, or the IAIS, is the global insurance standard setting body, and our members are insurance supervisors from more than 200 jurisdictions around the world. We have both supervisors with a market conduct and a prudential mandate. As the IAS, we are responsible for developing and assisting in the implementation of principles, standards, and guidance, as well as supporting material for the supervision of the insurance sector. This slide shows which topics have been selected as strategic themes for the IIS work program under the current strategic plan from 2020 until the end of this year. You'll see that diversity, equity, and inclusion, or in short, DE&I, are cited here as well. DE&I is a strategic theme for the IIS because we consider that a focus on improving and sustaining DE&I within the insurance sector will help insurers to build cultures that better support both prudential and consumer outcomes. There's at least three main ways it can do so. For instance, DE&I contributes to strengthening corporate governance and risk management by improving decision-making and reducing the risk of groupthink. It can reduce the risk of misconduct by creating a stronger culture within insurers, but it can also create better consumer outcomes and greater innovation by incorporating a better awareness of the needs of different types of consumers into all aspects of managing the project lifecycle, and also in interacting with insurers' customers. Therefore, the IS aims to contribute to, but also accelerate, the already existing momentum of action by both insurance supervisors and the industry to advance D&I in the insurance sector. Given this, throughout last year and again keeping us busy this year, the IS is pursuing work that aims to help insurance supervisors further understand the benefits of D&I, highlight the connection between promoting D&I in the insurance sector and specific supervisory mandates and objectives of our members, and also by providing advice and examples on the range of available supervisory practices. In addition to the consultation paper that we are presenting today, this year the IS is also working on 2 other related papers. The first paper, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was authored by the IS Governance Working Group and was open for consultation between March and June this year. It looks at how D&I within an insurance institution, so the workforce, the leadership, the culture, the decision-making, can influence its governance, its risk management, and its corporate culture. It identifies relevant matters for supervisors to look at and potential actions supervisors can take to address potential and realized D&I issues. We are currently analyzing the feedback received, and we will incorporate this feedback as we finalize the paper. Secondly, the IS is working on an update to an existing application paper which deals with issues around the supervision and regulation of inclusive insurance markets. This was first published in 2012, and now in 2024, we're updating it to be more to reflect developments in the areas. And to round out the context, this slide points out a key piece of previous D&I work that the IAS has published. For today's purpose, I would really want to emphasize the first one you see here on the left, which is a stocktake report that we published in 2022. This was a public output and it's available on our website. You might find it also interesting to read because it really presented the IAS first step in its D&I journey, so to say. It presented the outcome of a survey we did of our members, engagement with a small sample of industry stakeholders, but also research into the work of other international organizations. And it also, this stocktake also led us to decide to work on these 2 application papers this year. The other resources cited on the slide are member-only resources, and they may benefit those of you who are part of the IAS membership, as you can access them on our members extranet. So let me now step towards the specifics of this actual consultation and explain a bit of terminology with you all. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, as the IAS, we set principles, standards, and guidance for insurance supervision. These are called the Insurance Core Principles, or ICPs in short, and they form the globally accepted framework for insurance supervision. The ICPs seek to encourage the maintenance of consistently high supervisory standards across all IAS member jurisdictions, and all IAS members are expected to implement these principles. We often refer to them as supervisory material. Application papers instead are supporting material. So they relate to the supervisory material, but they are different in nature, and notably they do not set new expectations or requirements. In other words, they are not standards at themselves, but they are supporting material really to help IAS member supervisors to put the actual standards or the ICPs into practice. Application papers often provide advice, illustrations, recommendations, and examples of good practice to supervisors on how they can actually implement the ICPs. Finally, I should also note that the proportionality principle is something that applies to the content of both application papers and also the ICPs. It allows a supervisor to translate the requirements in the ICPs or the descriptions set out in the application paper into a jurisdiction supervisory framework and reflect its legal structure, its market conditions, and also the range of consumers. In that sense, it allows the supervisor to either increase or decrease the intensity of supervision according to the risks present in that market. So with that understanding under the belt, we strongly encourage you to submit your feedback in this consultation, and we're organizing this session to give you some background, but also already to answer any preliminary questions you might have. This slide really just reminds you of the process and the timelines, which you can also find on the website under iasweb.org/consultations. First of all, the most important thing to note is, of course, the deadline for providing your comments. So we really appreciate to receive your feedback, and you can do so until the end of Wednesday, 25 September. All feedback and comments have to be submitted via the consultation tool. For this particular consultation, we are not asking any specific question. Instead, we invite you to provide feedback on the general paper, but you can also provide your feedback on each of the specific sections or boxes in the paper itself. You will find the necessary instructions when you go to the tool. We then hope to finalize the paper incorporating all of your feedback in the first half of the next year. So with that additional context and a reminder of the specific deadlines, I would like to pass to Mark White, the chair of the Market Conduct Working Group, to go through the actual material that is out for publication. Thank you very much.
This webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Mark White here. I'm the chair of the Market Conduct Working Group. I'm also from FISRA. I'm currently its CEO, and this is one of my last duties as I'll be moving on. And I'd like to mention that Rudy van Leeuwen from the Dutch regulator, who is my vice chair, will be stepping up to be the acting chair of the MCWG, and you'll be hearing from Rudy shortly in the presentation today. Why don't we go to the next page? Let me give you sort of expand on where Hannah left us. The application paper that we're discussing today is about DEI, one of the strategic imperatives for the IAS, and it intends to guide supervisors, but also insurers and intermediaries on thinking about diversity so that they can fulfill the requirements of ICP 19, the Insurance Core Principle on the conduct of business. It is not seek to expand the scope of ICP 19. It is an application paper which seeks to define how fair treatment can be achieved for diverse consumers. In doing this, it actually looks from both a wider social impact perspective, and it's hoping that we will have a dialogue with those through the consultation and then after the paper is finalized, so that market supervisors and market participants will be able to discuss how practices can evolve so that as insurance it meets changing needs in different marketplaces across the world, that diverse consumers can be considered and that their needs will be met so that they are fairly treated according to ICP 19. Now, when we're talking about diverse consumers, and there are more extensive definitions in the application paper, and we're pleased to answer questions on later, Rudy will also touch on it, but generally what we're talking about are consumers or customers of insurers that are not part, from that insurer's perspective, of their normative or mainstream consumer profile. So when insurers or intermediaries are dealing with them, they have to consider that those consumers will have unique characteristics of diversity, and those could be inherent to the individual, or they could have characteristics which are caused by circumstances of vulnerability. And those circumstances of vulnerability may be very situational, so that someone who is not a diverse consumer may, due to certain stresses in their personal life, let's say a natural catastrophe issue affecting them, where their insurance needs are preeminent in their lives, they will be in a circumstance of vulnerability. Why don't we go to the next slide, please? Now, let me give you a bit of background on Insurance Core Principle 19 on the conduct of business. It is about setting out the standards for insurers and intermediaries of what they should be thinking about to make sure that their customers are well and fairly treated. It operates from the time an insurance product is designed, it's being marketed, and it continues all through the product life cycle, so that consumers, and in the case of this application paper, particularly diverse consumers, will be well treated. In the paper, and we will elaborate on this a bit more, there are three particular sections or standards within ICP 19, which are important for you to consider. The first is the general duty of care. ICP 19.1. That's where the supervisor is to require insurers and intermediaries to act with due care, skill, and diligence when dealing with their customers, and that means all customers, including diverse consumers. ICP 19.2 is about supervisors requiring insurers and intermediaries to establish and implement policies and processes to achieve the fair treatment of consumers. And that is to be achieved through integration into the business culture so that conduct will be an inherent part of that insurer or intermediary's business. This is about controls, processes, and governance within those regulated entities. And you'll hear later from Rudy about how the paper takes this big picture focus on looking at the culture within a regulated entity. And ICP 19.5, that's about the supervisor requiring insurers to take into account that there are different types of consumers when they're developing and they're distributing, so the marketing process of their products. As you can see from these three ICP 19s, that insurer and intermediary obligations exist all through the product life cycle, from design of product, marketing, distribution, through servicing, until all the obligations of the insurer or intermediary to that consumer or customer are discharged. There's also some other parts where we rely on ICP 19, referred to on the bottom of the slide, about advice, claims handling, and complaints handling. And it's not mentioned on the slide, but it is also important to note that ICP 19.0.1, which is referenced in the paper, talks about more the sectoral obligations of insurers and intermediaries and what we're trying to achieve to make sure that there is fair outcomes for all consumers and that there's good practices to serve all consumer needs. Let's move to the next slide, please. This lays out the overall structure of the paper, and I'm going to talk a bit about section 1, and Rudy will take us through sections 2, 3, and 4. Section 1 is the background, gives you the context, the objective, some key terms. As Hannah alluded to, proportionality and jurisdictional specificities are to be respected. That's a core part of the IAIS principles in application papers, and I'll give a bit more detail on that in a moment. And section 2, it actually talks about the DEI concepts about fair treatment and how they're to be reconciled with business practices of insurers and intermediaries. We respect that they are for-profit businesses that exist to serve their shareholders. And so risk-based pricing, insurer autonomy on how they're going to decide what products to offer and who to offer them to, that is respected, subject to local jurisdictional specificities, and Rudy will elaborate on that later. Section 3 of the paper, it gives more information on what we mean by diverse consumers and how diverse consumers, as I alluded to earlier, can arise in situations of vulnerability, and examples of how unfair treatment of diverse consumers can arise, so that we're drawing on the experience that some supervisors have seen in their jurisdictions. Section 4 operates on a business culture, so a overall insurer and intermediary perspective, and also helps provide guidance throughout the product life cycle on how supervisors should look at insurers and intermediaries to see whether they are actually fairly treating diverse consumers, and also considers that the full impact of ICP 19 will only be achieved if we work together, that's supervisors, insurers, and intermediaries, for an inclusive insurance sector that will well serve the needs of diverse consumers. Next slide, please. As mentioned, section 1 of the application paper gives information on proportionality and jurisdictional specificities. We recognize that the conduct of business, and this is not just in this application paper, but it's inherent in ICP 19, that good conduct is closely linked with the jurisdiction specificities, its tradition, its culture, its legal regime, and where that sector is in development, from a sophisticated, complex sector to one that is meeting basic needs. And so we have to take that into account in considering what is appropriate conduct. And so those local circumstances will be relevant to identifying who are diverse consumers and what special preferential treatment is necessary under ICP 19 to make sure that they are fairly treated. And that requires insurers, intermediaries, and their supervisors to look at the laws of the jurisdiction, at existing standards, codes, the supervisor's mandate and policies, and frankly, business and cultural norms in that jurisdiction to determine what are the relevant supervisory expectations to ensure fair treatment of diverse consumers. With this, I'll pass it over to my Vice Chair and the future Acting Chair of NCWG, Rudy Van Leeuwen. Rudy, please take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Over the next few slides, I will describe the content that is addressed in the sections 2, 3, and 4 of the paper, as Mark already pointed out. Section 2 of the paper addresses the concepts of risk-based pricing and insurance autonomy to decide on the scope of the business. The paper sets out how we see that those aspects of insurance business can coexist with D&I considerations. And I want to emphasize, it's not the case that the paper abolishes them. Rather, what do we do in Section 2 is give examples of how the application of diversity, equity, and inclusion principles and values should be prompting insurers to rethink or think more deeply about the use of risk-based pricing and their decisions around the scope of the business, with the objective of achieving fair treatment of all consumers, including diverse consumers. To share with you some of the examples set out in this paper, on risk-based pricing, you can think about using current information instead of outdated data, or adopting policies specifying that certain less relevant or outdated information will not be factored into risk-based pricing models for the reason of enhancing fairness. And on having an insurance business that's more inclusive to a diverse range of consumers, examples are, for instance, insurers and intermediaries using demographic data, community stakeholder engagement, and policyholder demographic research to identify the extent to which they are servicing diverse consumer segments and to verify how they are treating all customers fairly, notwithstanding any diverse or vulnerable characteristics. The paper makes clear that while the insurance sector as a collective is urged to meet the needs of diverse consumers, individual insurers are subject to local requirements that might be in place, autonomous businesses. This paper is not compelling any individual insurer to have to start offering a new product range or to have to change its target market. But what is the case is that insurers and intermediaries have obligations throughout the product lifecycle to treat customers, including diverse customers, fairly. A fair treatment means that once you are marketing your product to a certain customer or you have contracts with them, then you are obliged to treat them fairly to the point at which all obligations under the contract have been satisfied. In a few slides' time, I'll come to the fuller list of recommendations that the paper makes, with section 4 on how to achieve fair treatment of diverse customers. Next slide, please. Coming to section 3. Section 3 of the paper explains what is meant by diverse consumers. Some definitions of key terms used in the paper are provided already earlier within box 1 of the introduction section, as Mark explained. But then section 3 expands upon what we mean by diverse consumers, as this clearly is fundamental to understanding the paper. The term diverse consumers, as we use it in the paper, means people who are not part of the normative or mainstream consumer profile that insurers and intermediaries most often anticipate and cater to. Diverse consumers are not one homogeneous group. Instead, the focus of the concept is that there are people due to their diversity characteristics and or circumstances of vulnerability who have needs that differ compared with the needs of the normative or mainstream consumer profile. Characteristics that make consumers different may include, but are not limited to, things like age, disability, medical conditions, ethnicity, and gender. Which characteristics constitute a diverse consumer versus a typical mainstream or normative consumer depend upon the local context and particular situation. The second point is that the paper does not designate a certain diverse consumer profile that must be treated in a defined way. Local context, including legal, cultural, and political, will play a role in helping supervisors, insurers, and intermediaries to determine what characteristics are making someone diverse. And changes over time and circumstances may create new classes of diverse consumers or change the treatment necessary to achieve a fair outcome for certain classes of consumers. Final point is that the paper recognizes the concept of vulnerable consumers, being people especially susceptible to harm due to personal characteristics and or external circumstances. And that although everybody is at risk of becoming vulnerable at some point in their life, diversity characteristics can increase this risk. It's also the case that depending on local requirements applicable to the use of these terms, diversity and vulnerability may intersect or overlap. Next slide, please. And then, having explained what is meant by diverse consumers, the rest of section 3 of the paper sets out how unfair treatment of diverse consumers can arise. This is based upon examples collected from market conduct working group members and insights drawn from engagement with consumer groups. The paper explains that diverse consumers have been and may in future continue to be treated unfairly in cases that include, for instance, insurance that does not effectively meet a consumer's need, or issues related to after-sales servicing, a lack of access to insurance, and even intentionally targeting of vulnerable consumers. In box 2, you can see examples highlighting how diverse consumers can face exclusion from or even discrimination in respect of insurance products based on diversity, and create situations where supervisors, insurers, and intermediaries should consider whether consumer outcomes are aligned with ICP 19, ICP 19 being fair treatment of consumers. Next slide, please. Next, we arrive at section 4 of the paper, which focuses on the implementation of ICP 19 to drive fair treatment for diverse consumers. The recommendations in subsections 4.1 to 4.4 of this paper concern how to implement ICP 19 in a way that achieves fair treatment of diverse consumers. More specifically, in 4.1, the yellow circle in the graphic on the slide, probably embedding the fair treatment of diverse consumers is part of the business culture, and 4.2 to 4.4, the blue cycle surrounding the business culture, securing the fair treatment of diverse consumers at each stage of the product lifecycle, which includes product design, sales and distribution, and after-sales servicing, product monitoring, and review. Next slide, please. And then in subsection 4.5, the paper makes suggestions to give effect to the full intent of ICP 19 by encouraging the supervisor community and the insurance sector to work towards a more inclusive insurance sector in total, that better serves diverse consumers' insurance needs, including those consumers who are currently underserved or who require special considerations when receiving insurance services. The suggestions cover the role supervisors can play in shaping the supervisory landscape in a way that incorporates D&I considerations and in facilitating the development of inclusive products and markets. So to end, I would underscore that this paper is about the application of ICP 19 to achieve the fair treatment of diverse consumers, and is also about encouraging, through a wider social impact goal, a proactive dialogue among market participants and supervisors on how to continue to evolve practices to support initiatives that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion for insurance consumers. Let me stop here. We look forward to your participation in the consultation. I will now pass back to Lauren. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rudy, and thank you, Mark, for the overview of the paper. So we arrive now to the Q&A component. And I would also introduce to you Swati Agrawal from the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, Canada, who is a member of the market conduct work and has served as project lead of this project. So you have us all here to answer questions or receive your brief comments on the paper. And I would invite any raised hands. Okay, so a reminder that you can raise your virtual hand and then I'll invite you to ask your question. So if we could start, please, with Bernie Birnbaum.
So this is Bernie Birnbaum with the Center for Economic Justice. Thank you for holding this session. My question is, what is the application paper guidance for the situation in which insurers' profit motive produces adverse outcomes for diverse consumers? Is there any role for the supervisor or legislature to address competitive dynamics that produce adverse outcomes for diverse consumers?
Okay, Bernie, thanks for that question. And I think what I'll do is pass to Mark to answer that question in the first instance.
Bernie, thank you very much for the question. One of the key issues that we discussed within the MCWG and then within the IAIS in preparing this paper is exactly that linkage and the tension between insurers being for-profit businesses and also having to well serve their consumers. Now, there is a layer of local specificities and local requirements. So we completely concede that that is a jurisdiction-specific question as to what particular obligations that will be put on insurers and intermediaries to well serve diverse consumers. So, for example, many countries will have their own laws on discrimination, human rights practices, what's acceptable information to use in insurance underwriting practices, how consumers have to be served with if they have disabilities. So all of those are specific requirements, and this paper seeks to support jurisdictions in providing those local specificities. I will say that the paper also tries to go beyond that and to say that when you look at ICP-19 and you look at its overall objectives about building trust and confidence, promoting fair outcomes, making sure that there's fair treatment of consumers where those consumers exist. So there is an expectation that we as supervisors and where we can influence policymakers, and that includes insurers and intermediaries influencing policymakers, insurance provides an important societal good, and there's an expectation that we should all be pushing forward to make sure that the needs of diverse consumers are met, in addition to looking at those local requirements which also apply. Lauren, I'm not sure if you or any other panelists want to add anything else to Bernie's very excellent question.
Any other panelists wanted to come in and add to the response that Mark has provided to the question? And Bernie, did you want to say something? I see your hand is up again in response.
Yes, I did want to follow up. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for articulating the sort of the complexities of trying to develop a global standard across a variety of jurisdictions with a variety of laws and cultural perspectives. But your answer seemed to indicate that it's a complex issue, but my question is there any guidance in the paper for how to actually address that particular conflict? If insurers pursuing their profit motive, for example, start using types of data that discriminate against diverse consumers, or any other practice in achieving their profit targets, discriminate against diverse consumers, what kind of guidance is provided in the application paper to address that dynamic?
Yeah, Bernie, discrimination is wrong under ICP-19, and we expect that discrimination would be wrong under local rules as well. The question I was alluding to, which I think is the more complicated one, is what is considered to be improper or unfair discrimination. At a very literal level, the word discrimination also means to separate between different classes of risks, and insurance is actually in the business of understanding risks and assessing them and pooling appropriately and then charging appropriately. So on one level, that is, if you will allow me to use the term, fair discrimination, and it is actually part of risk-based pricing. What is improper under ICP 19, and we believe is improper under the member jurisdictions, but they may define it differently, is improper discrimination. So, for example, taking into account, immigration status, race. In some jurisdictions, gender is a source of discrimination. In other jurisdictions, gender is actually allowed in certain types of insurance as being proper risk-based pricing. So that's why it is a very nuanced question, but unfair or improper discrimination that does not fairly treat diverse consumers under ICP 19, and this application would say that is improper, and supervisors, insurers, and intermediaries are required to take action to remove that unfair discrimination, regardless of whether it affects their profits.
Can I do one more follow-up?
On the same theme, Bernie?
Yes.
Okay, yes.
So what is the guidance, if any, in the application paper in a situation where an insurer is engaged in fair discrimination, but that fair discrimination produces adverse outcomes for vulnerable or diverse consumers?
So that's probably a product life cycle question, because you've said that it's fair discrimination but produces unacceptable outcomes or adverse outcomes for diverse consumers. So let's say that the product's at the construction phase, the design phase, that there's an intended target market, but that product actually, and so it wasn't really intended to sell to a certain category of customers, but they do actually sell to that customer. Once you sell to a consumer, once that consumer becomes your customer, then you have an obligation to meet them where they are and to serve them in their diversity and to recognize that. So what may be acceptable, let's say in the risk-based pricing when you're constructing the product and designing it, when you move further through the product life cycle, because they are your customer, or maybe that consumer actually changes and their needs change, or let's say they acquire a disability or a circumstance of vulnerability, there is a positive obligation under ICP 19 to actually well serve that diverse consumer where they are. So this is a very situational issue that evolves through the product life cycle. That's one of the reasons why this is such a complex issue. But overall, I go back to the fundamental premises of ICP 19, which is making sure that consumers, particularly in this paper, diverse consumers, are well treated. And so understanding that risk-based pricing is not a shield to basically say, well, we were doing it because we thought those were the right risks and we just tried to make money and we didn't intend to serve that consumer. No, they are your customer and you now have to actually meet their needs in their diversity. And then if you look at section 4 of the paper, you'll see how we go through the product life cycle and talk about the changing obligations under ICP 19 of insurers and intermediaries to well serve their consumers through the product life cycle.
And I might supplement it just to also point to your attention, Bernie. I think section 2 of the paper, and particularly subsection 2.1, which talks about risk-based pricing, I think we've included some comments there that go to the scenario or the tension that you outline about how risk-based pricing can be rethought, or the use of it can be challenged a bit by insurers themselves to say, how can we be fairer for the outcomes that will result from our use of risk-based pricing for diverse consumers? And it gives some examples of how to do that. And for instance, one of those is that insurers can decide to adopt policies that specify that certain information is not going to be part of their risk-based pricing algorithms any longer. And one example of that is in some jurisdictions, previous medical diagnoses, previous cancer history is forgotten from a certain point in time, or HIV, patients with HIV or people living with HIV, latest medical information would suggest that certain factors that used to be considered in risk-based pricing for those people should no longer be. So I think the section of the paper there might get at your question also. Let's move to our next question. And just before I pass to David Snyder, I would like to remind people also that, please raise your virtual hand or use the chat box if you would rather put your question in writing in the chat box.
Morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I know from the industry side, we very much share the goals and desires of supervisors as set forth in the paper to be able to offer as much insurance to as many people as possible. And we think particularly in the corporate governance area that commitment has been well shown. I do have a couple questions about the paper, however. There seem to be a lot of what I'll call shoulds in the paper. Examples include, for example, how to take into account how people process information, whether they're under acute distress, issues like that seem to impose a very extensive set of potential mandates on insurers that may, when you put it all together, actually discourage insurers from offering products effectively, because they need to take into account not only the service that they're providing, but the cost of that service to maintain availability and affordability for all their customer base. And so I guess the first question I have is, has any jurisdiction that you're aware of actually implemented all of the quote shoulds, end quote, in the paper? And then secondly, there appear to be places in the paper where they're making specific recommendations, and we just heard a discussion of that actually run counter to the jurisdiction's law, for example, in the US on rating factors that are permitted. So I'm interested in how we work together to make sure that we have an end result that's actually feasible and workable, not only from a theoretical standpoint, but from a very practical standpoint. So I guess my question is, from the standpoint of the insurance industry, what kind of feedback are you looking for? And what would be most helpful to move forward? And again, our objective is the same as yours, which is to provide as broad coverage to as many people in as many circumstances as possible. Thanks much.
David, thank you for the question. So I'm hearing from you sort of, I think, three key components to the question. The first being, are there around the use of should in the paper, and you're highlighting a risk that implementing all the shoulds would, amounts to a standard that is not practical and would discourage the provision of insurance to a broader range of people. Secondly, you've highlighted an issue about jurisdictional specificities, and thirdly, about just ensuring all the suite of concepts picked up in the paper are practically workable, and what feedback would we most want from the sector. So I think just to help our panelists pick up those three themes in responding, maybe I will take firstly the sort of jurisdictional specificities point about the US you gave as an example, and I would ask Mark if he wants to respond on that part.
Thanks, Lauren. I actually find it hard to separate out the pieces, so I will try and deal with the jurisdictional specificities point, but the may versus should is a very important part of the paper, and I do think we are asking for that type of guidance, and recognizing that it will, and to your comment, David, about does any jurisdiction think they actually meet this, and I think that the members of the working group believe that their jurisdictions do meet it, subject to that they have local specificities. And so there is always going to be that layer of that actually defines, and I gave the example earlier to Bernie, for example, some jurisdictions, gender for certain types of insurance is a permitted form of risk-based discrimination, so an acceptable form of determining risk, whereas in other jurisdictions, for certain product lines, it is not. And so it's necessary to ask that question at not just an ICP 19 level, but then at the application level. And so, for example, in an international organization providing comments on this, we'll need to find how we can not try to put forward just the perspectives of one jurisdiction, but actually that flexibility. And that's what we've tried to achieve in the paper. And so those shoulds are always taken as subject to the requirements of local specificities. So I hope that answers at least part of your question. And I'm sorry, Lauren, I think I probably ended up swapping into the other buckets or parts of the question.
No, that's okay. That's just all the more efficient. Rudy, Swati, do you want to add to the answer?
I agree with what Mark said. It depends on the local circumstances if elements of the shoots or the maze have been dealt with. We see situations where, for instance, elderly, not digital savvy, their requirements are being taken into account in order to make sure that the services after the product's been sold is being taken into account and the people will get the service they deserve, need, and expect. So and it depends per jurisdiction, per country, per around the world. So I think that, yeah, I agree that with Mark.
And perhaps just finally, just to point back to the explanation given by Hannah at the start, that an application paper is not introducing new standards. It's all about recommendations of how to put into practice the existing ICP 19 and actions that are should, recommendations, and particularly they are about good practice.
And may I add one thing, because it was always also asked what kind of feedback do we want? But if you've got good examples how things work around the work from your from the insurers you represent, please share them with us, because through the supervisors we get a good picture of how things work around the world, but you probably will find other examples that will work as well, so that we can get a whole set of good examples of things, how diverse consumers are being treated fairly around the world.
And Swati, please come in.
I think my camera's got stuck, but I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
You know, as a project team, David, when we were discussing, we had multiple countries participate in the discussions. And one of your questions was that, did you see any of the jurisdictions actually implement the shoulds and the may? And I would say it was very much dependent on the regulatory maturity of that particular country. Even within the same country, if we evaluate different companies, different insurance companies and different intermediaries, there is a diversity in the regulatory maturity in terms of how they apply ICP 19 or how they even apply the shoulds and the mays. So I would say there is not a set answer for it, and it's quite situational depending on which country we are interacting with, the maturity that they have, or even the variation that exists between the nature, complexity, and the kind of products that are being offered within the same country by the different participants. So that is something that we very much observed while we were preparing the paper, and which is why this goes back to the point that we have to look into what the local specificities are and take that into account while applying the shoulds and mays. I hope that provides some context on how our thinking evolved about it.
It does, and thank you very much. And let me just end where I began my comments, which is we very much share the desire expressed here and by our supervisors around the world to maximize the availability of insurance coverage to all consumers. So thanks again for the opportunity, and we look forward to a continuing dialogue.
Thank you, David. Are there any other raised hands or questions to be posed? We'll give it just one more minute. I would just point for people's interest a little dialogue in the chat box, but I don't think there's a question there to be asked.
Lorna, I will just say that the chat, it raises a very important point. Obviously, intentional discrimination, which, you know, improperly treats diverse consumers is wrong. I think most people accept that. I think the paper goes on, my view is that ICP 19 tries to look at the outcomes. And so that actually is even a higher standard where insurers have to use their own internal controls, processes, governance to make sure, and that's part of business culture when you put all those together, to make sure that they're actually achieving fair consumer outcomes for diverse consumers. And I'll give the example of an algorithm, say used for underwriting, which may have been composed with the best of intentions, and it tries to use, let's say, credit information. It's not intending to be discriminatory, but if the actual outcome of that is to discriminate in an improper way against diverse consumers, I think that the outcome is wrong, and that my view is that's not consistent with ICP 19 and the fair treatment of those diverse consumers, even though that algorithm may have been developed with the best of intentions to just be good at risk-based pricing. If the outcome is unfair treatment of diverse consumers, my view is that that is not consistent in line with ICP 19.
Agree. Okay, well then, seeing the time, I would thank everybody for their attendance today. Thank you to the question askers. And a final reminder that please participate in our consultation. Submit your feedback by the 25th of September deadline. Your consultation responses must be submitted into our online consultation tool, and please follow the format that it sets out there, with general comments invited on the paper in one box, and then any specific comments on the content of the other subsections of the paper should be inserted into the corresponding field or box in the online consultation tool. So thank you, and you can access these slides, the recording of today's webinar, and of course the paper on which we're consulting on our webpage. And thank you from us, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.